Today on Paul's Old Crap, we're going to take a look at my Power Macintosh 8500 computer and discuss one of the ways you might be able to squeeze a little more processing power out of this system. How do you do that, you ask? This little box here from Newer Technology, and it holds a piece of magic called the PowerClip 604, which actually allows us to overclock the PowerPC 604 processor in this computer. Alright, so we're going to do a quick unboxing of the PowerClip. Now, first thing you might notice, it actually says for the PowerMac 9500, but the manual inside here actually mentions both the 8500 and the 9500. So I'm not too sure if there was any special reason why this was actually calling out the 9500 in particular, because it does work fine on the 8500. But, yeah. There's not really anything else notable on the box, so let's open this up. Okay, get rid of that. So we have a few things in here. Let's see, we have the warranty registration. You can fill this out if you really want. Ooh, it actually tells us there's a few other products. They made a power clip for the PowerPC 601. That's interesting. And then the one we have here is the power clip for the PowerPC 604. And then other accelerators, including the Mac clip for the Quadra and stuff like that. That's fascinating. But we're not going to fill that out, so yes. Ooh, we have a disposable wrist strap for static electricity when working on electronics. I like to live life on the edge, so never in the history of working on computers have I ever used one of these, so yeah. But anyway, these are the main things that we will need to look at. We've got the instruction manual over here. This does have some installation instructions, which I obviously had to read because I was getting a little confused about some of the stuff, but the black and white diagrams here, sometimes you can't really see what's going on. Like, this thing is zoomed in and pixelated. I don't even know what they were supposed to be actually displaying here because it's just all blurred, but yeah. But yeah, we'll be going through, obviously, the installation of this. And I did already go through this and understand how to do this properly, but yeah. So there's actually two sections in here, and one of the sections being Power Macintosh 8500. So obviously it does support the model that we're going to be installing this on. And yeah, actually the previous pages that we were looking at here, this was all for the 9500 as well. So yeah, like I said, even though the box says 9500, it actually does have the manual telling you how to do both the 8500 and the 9500. So yeah. Now, it does also make some mention of a processor fan. That there was no fan in this box, and I don't know if that was actually supposed to include a fan, but the overclock seems to run fine without a fan at the speeds I ran. But yeah, there's some of these diagrams that actually show a system fan being installed in the computer. So I don't know where that is, or if it was even part of this kit. So yeah, strange. Anyway, this little envelope here, when I first saw this, I was really confused because it has like all these little tiny metal pins in it, and I wasn't too sure what the deal is with that. Like these little things in here. but we'll talk about that more in a little bit. One other critical part of the kit, though, is this little piece of metal here, which actually helps secure the board to the, or helps secure the overclock board to the processor board. So yeah, we will obviously need that. And the most critical part is the overclock board itself. So yeah, it's very simple. I mean, there's really not much to this at all, and it's pretty interesting. So basically, you just dial in what you want to do on the switches there, and these little holes there actually fit on top of the existing crystal thing on the processor board, and that's all there is to it. I guess it just like sends a new frequency down to the down to those contacts or whatever it does. I don't know. Maybe it's magic, something like that. But yeah, let's jump into the installation of this, I guess. So the PowerMac 8500 tower that I have here is actually a recent addition to my collection, and I haven't actually done a full refurbishing of it, which is why it's covered in like dirt and everything. And yeah, like this is very fragile plastic, so basically I wanted to get this video done before I then did the recapping of the board and everything, because all of this plastic is going to break as soon as I start taking it apart. So once I reassemble it, I'm going to be using glue on everything, so I won't really have the opportunity to try this. But yeah, we've got the 120 megahertz PowerPC 604 module. This is one of the lower end modules for the 8500. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, this is actually the slowest module they ever released. And it just so happens the PowerClip is compatible with the 604 modules and probably not the 604E, which is what my 9500 tower has. So luckily, this module makes it easy for us to overclock with the PowerClip. So the way the PowerClip works is it needs to make physical contact with the crystal chip that's on the CPU module card. And in this case, it's actually these 4 pins right here that are on the underside of the CPU module. And if we take a look right in here, that little rectangle looking thing in there is the crystal, which determines the frequency that the processor runs at. So the PowerClip is a board that sits right on top here, and it has little pins which fit right over these things, and then you just dial in the frequency that you want. The first time I opened up this kit and was looking at the installation, I saw all of these little metal pins here, and it was kind of intimidating because I thought I had to do a bunch of weird custom stuff in order to make this work. But it turns out in the manual here, it basically tells you that the little pins there, that's actually for if the CPU module only has like surface mount connection. If it doesn't have those protruding pins off of the crystal chip. So in the case with the PowerMac 8500 CPU module we're going to be using for this, we won't actually need to use all of these little pin things. It makes it very easy to do this installation. And when we're looking at the board itself here, all we do is we flip this over, and it basically just has these little spots where it fits over the pins from that crystal. And there's numerous things here. So obviously, as we saw on the CPU module, there's actually only 4 of those little pins, but I think there's multiple spots here based on the different CPU modules having them in different locations or something like that. So when we actually install this onto the CPU module, it's only going to be using 4 of these pins. Now, if you're wondering how you actually change the frequency once you have this installed onto your CPU module, there's this little set of switches right on the top there. And based on the position of those switches, that determines the clock frequency that this board will run at. And there's actually a lot of different options for doing that. So let's take a look at some of our frequencies that are available to us. This is, there's a lot, and I'm actually not too sure why there's so many. Like for example, it goes like 138.5 megahertz to 139, 139.5, 140. I mean, there must be a reason that all of these were available, but the manual basically recommends that if you have a PowerMac 8500 running at 120 megahertz, it says that you should probably just try 150, which is over here. And all of this other stuff, I don't know, is just kind of irrelevant. And one interesting thing to note as well, when I was playing around with some of these frequencies already, I set the frequency of 133 megahertz and I booted up into TechTool, and TechTool detected the 133 megahertz processor, but it also said the system reported it as 140 megahertz, which is, I don't know, it's kind of odd. There's that discrepancy there, which I can't really explain, but yeah. Anyway, if we look at up here, the base frequency, if all of your switches are set to off, that's 120 megahertz. So with the PowerClip attached to the 8500, if we don't enable any of those switches, it'll just run at the exact same speed. But for our testing, what we're going to do is use the 150, because that already, in my testing, it did boot up with that, and it seemed fine, no problems. If you try to go above that, you might have some stability problems. It might not even boot. I think the troubleshooting in here said that trying to overclock too much could lead to weird problems. So yeah, the manual does say that 150 megahertz on the 120 module is safe, so we're going to go ahead and do that. And by doing that, we set the switches on the number 1 and the number 6 positions to be on, and that will adjust the crystal in there to think it's 150 megahertz. Yeah, pretty neat. So I think we're going to go ahead and do the installation of the PowerClip. So the way this works is obviously the chips have to sit upward, otherwise it would just kind of be goofy, and these things obviously wouldn't make contact with the pins below. Now it does say that we need to remove these 2 screws on the CPU board. So we pull these off, and it will actually line up with this board so that we know we have it in the right spot. These 2 holes here will line up with these holes here like this. Now, one thing we're also going to do is see if we can carefully drop this in place. And I believe that the contacts have been made on the underside. I don't know if you'll actually be able to see it, but yeah, I can just barely make out that the pins do appear to be in the right spot, right in there. And that also should mean that the holes line up for the screws. Almost. I think we'll just pull the screwdriver out for this. Yeah, that looks good for that side. And this one seems to also be lining up. So we don't want to make this too tight, but we don't want the board moving anywhere. Okay, so that feels like it's fairly secure. Now, part of the installation is also this little piece of metal, which actually clips up to the top here, and that kind of helps hold this board down. Because if you have, I guess, too much movement in the board here and there's not enough force pushing these pins down, potentially you might have some contact issues with the crystal, and then it won't actually apply your little settings there. And the way this works is kind of silly, but yeah, you can see there's this little this gap up in here, and that's what this clip is going to prevent. And the way this works is it says that the little circle part of the clip is actually supposed to be on the top here. And now there's other stuff on the board here, so I mean, I guess you have to be careful that you're not pushing this over top like some other contact over here, because the manual says to use like the very top corner. Well, there's a capacitor there, so we have to actually make sure that this moves downward a bit. Probably right around this point is where I had it before. So Just going to push that in with my thumb, and then we're going to drop this, of course. I think it was right in here. Now, I don't want to push this in all the way because I'm already going to be a little hesitant about like metal rubbing against a circuit board where you've got like traces and stuff like that. I mean, that makes it a little iffy for me, but I'm also not keeping this on my computer permanently. I actually prefer just to have the stock speed, but yeah, it can go further, I think, but the way the metal is like bent in here, it makes it it looks like it would be a real pain to try and remove this afterward, because it looks like it's designed to like really dig into the board. But I think we've accomplished what we needed to with this being pushed as far as it can down to the board there. And obviously on this side, it's going to stick up a little bit, but I mean, that should be irrelevant. This was working exactly like this for me already in my testing, so I think this is probably going to be enough contact in order to make the overclocking happen. So for the first test, we're going to actually keep this in the original factory configuration, which is all of the switches set to off. And if you recall, when we were looking at the frequency guide in the instructions, this indicates that the CPU clock will function at 120 megahertz, which is the original CPU speed of this module. We're just going to do a demonstration boot to verify that the CPU is in fact running at 120 megahertz, and then we'll actually proceed with the overclocking after that.
All right, so we've got our Power Macintosh 8500 all booted up. For this, I am running System Software 7.6.1. And what we're going to start off with is hopping into Tech Tool to basically verify what the current CPU status is. For this boot, we are running off of the default settings, so it should just come back as 120 megahertz, and that is correct. So our CPU speed is reported as 120 megahertz, our bus speed is 40 megahertz, and it is telling us we have a PowerMac 8500, and it is a PowerPC 604 processor, not the 604E. And this is pretty much all expected for the way the switches are configured on the board right now. This is basically the same thing as if I didn't have the board on there at all, and it was just running on the regular CPU module. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at MacBench. And this is basically going to run a set of benchmarks comparing it to, I think its baseline here is a PowerMac G3 300. But yeah, if we also hop into system info over here, it does also tell us our model number is the 8500/120, and we've got the 120 megahertz processor speed, and the 40 megahertz bus speed, 40 megahertz cache speed. And we're running a 604 processor. All of this is all expected. So yeah, we'll hop out of here. And I think what we'll do is we'll run this main test. And I think it's just going to run against the processor and the disk. So we'll go ahead and just run that now. And this is going to take a while. So basically, let's see. Oh yeah, it's complaining about the resolution of my screen, but who cares? So I'll just skip ahead in the video because this will take a few minutes to run. All right, so we've got here a processor score of 223 and a disk score of 350. And obviously these don't compare at all to the G3. So let's see. Just going to write this down for my own reference. And next time we boot up this computer, we'll be running the 150 overclock, I think, for the processor card. And I want to see what the difference would be with the scores. And I'm only really expecting the processor score to change, but the disk might go faster as well in the overclock. I'm not too sure. So,
okay, so we verified that it does function at 120 megahertz, the original clock speed. What we're going to go ahead and do is run this right up to 150 megahertz, which is the recommended value that they mentioned in the manual. And as you may recall from the frequency guide, it says that to set this to 150 megahertz, we set switches number 1 and number 6 in the on position. And there's little numbers right along the bottom here. There's a total of 8 switches on here. So I mean, like, yeah, that's basically all it took is flipping 2 switches, and we should have 150 megahertz. So I'm going to go ahead and reinstall this in the computer and give it a test. One thing I will note about the reinstallation of the CPU, you have to make sure this is fully seated, otherwise you might think you did something wrong. And that's actually what happened to me when I was doing my original testing. I pushed this in to the point where I thought it was seated, but it actually wasn't. And then the computer would only have the power blip for a moment, and then nothing would happen. And I thought maybe the PowerClip was defective, but no, it turns out I just don't know how to install CPUs properly. But yeah, lining this up inside the case is always a pain. It's got little guides that yeah, you can't really see very well. But yeah, basically pushes in a little bit, but then I think it pushes in even more. So yeah, you have to make sure it's fully seated, like you cannot push it anymore. And then you also have to be careful because, for example, this little piece here, these things down here like to break a lot. And if I bend this down any further, all of the plastic here will snap off. So because of this, I made this video right now before I install any PCI cards, because as soon as I do that, there won't be enough room to pull the CPU module out. And if I have to pull this down any further, I have to glue it all back together. And I don't really feel like doing that right now.
All right, so we've booted up the PowerMac 8500 again, and we are now running on the 150 megahertz overclock. So let's do some verification. First thing we're going to do is open up our copy of TechTool. And if we click down at hardware, it tells us our CPU speed is now 150 megahertz, and our bus speed has also increased to 50 megahertz. And it still tells us the rest of the information is accurate. You know, we're a PowerMac 8500, and we've got a PowerPC 604. The rest of this information is, I don't think, really that relevant for the overclocking information. But what we're going to do is we're going to exit that, and we're going to hop back into MacBench and take a look at what it says. So again, if we jump into System Info, so you'll notice that the model number is still 8500/120. However, it does come back saying that we are running at 150 megahertz with our bus and cache both at 50 megahertz there. So I think, yeah, basically it knows that the original CPU module is in there giving us this model number, but it is correctly telling us that we have overclocked a processor. So what we're going to go and do now is run the main tests. And yes, that might take a while. So, yep, continue. So what we'll do is speed up the video and see what the results are like compared to the other test that we did. Okay, so when we look at the scores now compared to the previous one, processor score is 281, and the previous test running at the stock speed was 223, so there's a good increase there. And the disk is actually a little bit faster as well. Currently, we're showing a score of 385 on the disk, and the original score was 350 for the slower original speed. So definitely see some improvements there. This is basically, well, I mean, you can pretty much expect this sort of thing anyway with the higher clock speed and whatnot, but yeah, I mean, I'm not actually sure how much they originally charged for this overclock kit, but I mean, yeah, it obviously gives you results, but for the sake of my museum, I'm not actually going to keep the overclock kit installed in this computer. I actually want to keep the computer at the original 120 megahertz so it matches the badge on the front. I've got tons of Macs. A lot of them are faster than this one. I don't need this one to be faster than the original stock speed. So, but yeah, I basically wanted to perform these tests before I glue this computer all together and never take it apart again. So, yeah, definitely pretty neat. And I'll probably just throw the overclock kit back in my storage, and it'll sit there until who knows what. So. But yeah, it obviously works, and I think this ended up being a pretty neat experiment. Anyway, I don't think there's anything else left to say about it. Thanks for watching.